Well, good evening to everyone tuning in. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. My name is Billy Rainey. I'm the Digital Outreach and College Ministries Coordinator here at Oxford University United Methodist Church in Oxford, Mississippi. I'm joined today by my co-host, Reverend Chris McAlilly, who's one of our pastors here at OU, as we like to call our church. And then we also have our special guest, Dr. Esau McCaulley, who we are so thankful to have with us. And I'm going to pass it over to Chris, and he's going to tell us a little bit about Dr. McCaulley and why we have him here today. Chris, it's all you.
Yeah, I just want to start with a bit of an introduction. We have with us today the Reverend Dr. Esau McCaulley, currently in a position at Wheaton College as Assistant Professor of New Testament. He served in a number of professional contexts through his ministerial career and academic career, from Okinawa, Japan, to Portsmouth, Virginia, to St. Andrews, Scotland. He completed his PhD in New Testament at the University of St. Andrews, where he studied under the direction of N.T. Wright. His research and writing focuses on Pauline theology and the intersection of race, Christian identity, and the pursuit of justice. His doctoral dissertation was called Sharing in the Son's Inheritance, focused on Pauline theology and the role of the Jewish Messiah, those who are heirs of Christ, who become part of the Abrahamic promises and covenant in Galatians. He's also a priest in the Anglican Church of North America, director of the Next Generation Leadership for them, and is a husband to Mandy, who's a pediatrician and a Navy reservist. And they have 4 wonderful children. I assume those children are somewhere close by. And
you might see them tonight. You never know.
You never know. That's the world that we're living in. We, for a couple of years, have followed your writing, Dr. McCaulley, and we're really grateful for your presence with us tonight. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
One of the things I wanted to do, we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation tonight. We want you guys to be involved as well. There's a Q&A section that Billy will kind of alert you to in a moment. I just wanted to frame kind of why we felt like it would be a good thing to bring you in to conversation with our church, our community. We're in Oxford, Mississippi, long-time downtown historic United Methodist Church. Oxford has a long history that is full of wonderful arts and culture and writing and visual artists, et cetera. It also has struggled through the especially the last 20 or 30 years with its racial history. The University of Mississippi is a big part of what makes our community what it is. And over the course of the last several months, really from the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, it awakened some pain in the community of Oxford that led to protests, some of which were led by student athletes and activists and other community members. It centered not only on police brutality generally in America, but also on Confederate symbolism and monuments. It led to the removal of the Confederate symbol on our state flag, and really kind of raised in the Christian community in Oxford questions about what faithful public witness looks like, and what kind of community we want to be long term. And it kind of intersected with your own work and a book that has recently come out called Reading While Black, African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. And it felt like the kind of book that we wanted to put in conversation with our church and our community, and to give voice and raise awareness of kind of what you're talking about and writing about. So that's kind of the frame for tonight. So we're going to do we're going to kind of get to all of those different dimensions, but I just wanted to start by asking you about your vocational journey as a biblical scholar. I feel like from your writing and clearly from the book, but also from other things I've heard from you, you love the Bible, and you came to an adult appreciation of it at a certain point and a desire to kind of enter into vocation and a profession as a biblical scholar. I wondered if you would kind of unpack that journey a little bit.
Yeah, I grew up. It's important if we're all located, right? That if your story is influenced by Oxford, Mississippi, my story is influenced by Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville is like a little ways from Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma. It's like the city that I tell people that's surrounded by history, but within which nothing like world famous actually occurs. And so I grew up in the shadow of the civil rights movement. And I grew up in the Black church that valorized those leaders as the pillar of what it meant to be Christian. And so we emphasize the reverend in the Dr. Martin Luther King, both his spirit, his Christian faith, along with his academic pedigree. Because I was raised in a context where like supporting, caring about justice and the scriptures were like hand in hand. And I just thought that's what you did as a Christian. I didn't realize there's really another way of being Christian. So I then went to college, and I was planning to double major in African American history and Bible. The amazing thing about that is that like in the long arc of history, I end up back at the same place where I began as an 18-year-old. But it was there, and I've talked about it, that I first encountered higher criticism. But the higher criticism part really wasn't it, right? It's not that as an academic, we don't understand hard questions and the complexity of the scriptures and those kinds of things. But it was really like I was invited to take sides in a fight that began way before I got there. And it was really the struggle between like fundamentalism and evangelicalism. Evangelicalism and the mainline tradition, and trying to make sense of which side of that fight that I felt that I should take. But what I ultimately discovered is that like most of the questions that were animating the evangelical mainline divide weren't the same questions that animated like the community that I was from. And so I found myself getting trained to educate the community or train people for ministry who would never actually touch down in places like where I grew up. And so, yeah, like if you're going to ask certain questions, I'm going to give the answers to them. And so if you consider my first book, Sharing in the Son's Inheritance, I think it's an important contribution to inheritance issues in Galatians. But I knew that like nobody in my community was ever going to read that book. And so I began to say to myself, well, how can I do biblical scholarship that my mom would read, right? And so Reading While Black ultimately is my attempt to take the best of what I learned in the academy and put it into conversation with the culture in the church to shape me, and then present that both to the Black community as kind of giving back this thing that they gave to me, and it's something to say to the wider culture. African American Christianity has something important to say. And so really, it was to me the fulfillment of a stewardship, right? I was given this precious thing as a kid. And the hard thing to do, maybe anyone who goes into higher education or anyone who goes into, they kind of leave home when they go into the world. It's like, how do you become an adult with your own decisions, your own ideas, but not lose track of who you are? And so Reading While Black was me trying to come to grips with who I was and how who I was influenced how I did biblical interpretation, which means I'm like a quirky part of the academy because I don't necessarily fit the categories that weren't designed for people like me.
One of the things that you say in the introduction of Reading While Black is that when you were there in your biblical studies or your religious studies class in college, and you went to Sewanee University of the South, for those who are not aware of that part of your story, that your professors were trying to kind of you entered into a war between white evangelicals and white progressives.
Yes.
And the way that they read scripture. And there was one of the things, just one paragraph that I think is interesting if you're kind of orienting yourself to this work. One doesn't have to dig very far, you write, into history to see how fundamentalist Christians in the South and in the North have inflicted untold harm on Black people. They've used the Bible as justification for their sins, personal and corporate. But there's a second testimony, probably more important than the first, and that's the testimony of Black Christians who saw that same Bible as the basis of their dignity and hope in a culture that denied them of both. In my professor's attempt to take the Bible away from fundamentalists, he also robbed the Black Christian of the rock on which they stood. I think that's really Yeah, I mean, it's unpack that a little bit. Talk a little bit more about kind of how you worked your way through that.
So basically, it's like this. People say that the Bible was used to justify slavery. The Bible was used to justify Jim Crow, and that's actually true. And so, like that, the diagnosis I agree with, right? The diagnose that people use the Bible to do untold damage, and that's just part of being honest, right? Being a Christian and being honest about the past and say this is what many white Christians did. But at the same time, while this is happening, there are the African American Christians are looking in those same texts saying we disagree, and we're saying that the fundamentalists who are calling us inferior were bad interpreters of the Bible. So I grew up being taught that the people who used the Bible to justify their sinfulness were bad interpreters. So then when I got to graduate school, to undergrad, I had this feeling of like, well, no. They were correct to see that the Bible did these things. And the only way the Bible can be a friend to the Black Christian is if it's deconstructed. And then we will tell you which parts of that Bible are relevant. So then that put me in the place, well, hold on. If I'm only like receiving the Bible as mediated through like the majority culture, then the Bible and Christianity does become a white man's religion. Because it is someone who's white telling me like how I need to reconstruct the Bible to make sense of what it means to be a Christian, when I already had a way of reading the Bible to make sense of what it meant to be a Christian. And so I found myself saying, I agree with you in your critique of the damage done by fundamentalism, but I disagree with the solution to that. And so it was my way of saying, as an interpreter, if we're going to allow Black Christians to like chart their own path, then I need to find my own way of dealing with the legacy of Christianity's failures in the United States. And my way of dealing with that failure is not deconstructive. It's a reassertion and a new context of what I think are like the core theological and spiritual insights of my ancestors as it relates to the person of Christ and the wider New Testament testimony.
I want to give Billy a chance to jump in here. Just a reminder to drop a question in the chat for Esau if you have one. Billy?
You muted.
I am in charge of digital communications here, and I can't even unmute myself.
Is this your first Zoom?
Apparently it is. As Chris was saying before I showed my incompetence, this is a Q&A session, and you feel free, if you are watching, to drop a question in the Q&A section of this webinar, and I'll be receiving them. I'll try to keep an eye, so if you see me doing this, I have another screen ready for that. So be sure, if you have any questions along the way, go ahead and drop them. I'll keep an eye out. We'll try and insert them as the conversation goes on. We actually already have some questions specifically on the topic of the book while we're talking specifically about the book. Here is one that says, you address the book to, quote, Black believers who continue to turn to the scriptures for guidance. This book was, further quote, this book was an attempt to fulfill a trust given to me by my mother and the church of my childhood. But as we've seen, the book really does have many audiences. So this person was curious, how has the reception to the book so far shaped the way that you see it working?
I've been surprised by the reception of the book, to be honest. I mean, I'm glad that people are interested in hermeneutics, but by the way, I'm not going to retire off the sales of this book. But for a hermeneutics book, it has made kind of a pretty large impact. And so it's been encouraging, because one of the things that I was hoping that people would realize is that, like, when I talk about African American biblical interpretation, it doesn't mean that it's closed off from the rest of the church. I really meant it as a way of saying, here are the gifts that we can offer to the wider Christian community. And to see like non-Black Christians say, yeah, I have been helped as a person in my spiritual life through reading this book. That's exactly what I would have hoped for. I was afraid that people would see it and they would immediately not understand what I was trying to do and what I was trying to articulate. So I think that has been helpful. I think that I have also been really encouraged by African American readers who said, like, I've been wanting a book like this for a long time that spoke to my experience. And so I didn't think that the book was revolutionary in the sense that it said something that no one has said before. But I did think that it was bold because it was a risk, right? Because I mean, it's ultimately a long apologetic for the ongoing role of Scripture in the lives of African American Christians, by implication, like the wider society, with the wider group of people who call themselves Christians. And so to write a book like that dealt with the difficult issues, people could have called it special pleading. There's all kinds of things that couldn't happen. And so the fact that it's been generally well received, and in the beginning, like the first chapter, it has what I think are careful like critiques, but it's like no one comes out of chapter 1 unscathed. And so those are all like risks that I took. And so thus far, it's only a month in, we'll see what happens. Maybe October will be a different experience, but so far I've been really encouraged by it, especially by the fact that because I'm still engaging in biblical interpretation. Sorry, let me say this one more thing. So there's a way of doing socially located exegesis where if you're not from that culture, you can't engage it. And so what I wanted this book to be was profoundly exegetical in its like presentation, so that people could see me actually interpreting the Bible. And in as much as like the process of interpretation is something that all Christians do, that other communities could kind of benefit from it. And so I've been encouraged by it. It's been really funny. I've heard like 2 or 3 reviews that said, I was surprised by how much Bible was in there. And I was like, it's called Reading While Black, and African American biblical interpretation. And so people were like, there's a lot of Bible. I was like, well, I do New Testament. And so that's one funny response, is like, there's a lot of Bible in here. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad that people are getting a big bucket of scripture for one of my books too.
I was really struck by, so if you think about racism as a theological problem, you describe it as it's a problem with the way white Christians have read the Bible. It's heresy in a sense. But on the flip side, I thought it was interesting. The way you use Frederick Douglass. I normally think of Frederick Douglass as an abolitionist and a suffragist and an author and an editor and a diplomat. I don't normally think of him as a biblical interpreter. But I thought that what you were doing there was quite interesting. As I read it, you kind of hold him up as an exemplar of
patron saint of Black ecclesial interpretation. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so I wonder, as you think about kind of the future of biblical studies for yourself and other Black scholars of the Bible, kind of what other opportunities do you see for biblical studies to kind of be grounded in 19th century Black Christian approaches to the Bible?
I'm looking because hold on one second. I'm not alone, because a friend of mine named Lisa Bowens has this book called African American Readings of Paul. And she does basically a similar thing where she looks at early African American interpretation of Paul, because we kind of have this stereotype of African Americans. Actually, let me put this in the context. So we have this caricature of how Black people read the Bible back in the day. That they only thought about the Exodus and they became Christians because the Bible talks about freedom from slavery, and we want to be free from slavery. And that's partially true. Like we identify with the Exodus narrative. There's a long history of African American engagement in biblical text that has often been lost to history. And so my book and her book and others are part of what happens when we look to what the actual Black Christians said and take that seriously as a source of theological reflection. So what I think is the future then is that there's the difference between, and this is one of the things that I learned, there's a difference between like basically proof texting from the African American Christian past and finding things that you already wanted to say and then finding like dead Black people who said it, versus actually being shaped by those texts and help them influence the way that you think about what it means to be a Christian today. And so I think that one of the potential, like the future for African American biblical interpretation involves continuing to be allowed to be shaped by the witness of that tradition. One example that I give as to like the way that the book changed me is, if you go back and you look at these things, you look at Frederick Douglass, you look at a variety of people who are cited in there, there's a certain plain spokenness in calling sin what it is that kind of melted my, I was like, I can't believe Frederick Douglass said this in like 18 whatever. And I said, oh my goodness, I would have been hesitant to speak that plainly in my own context. And the more I began to realize it, the more I began to see that there's a tradition of what I call like Black audacity in our rhetorical style, because we had to make it plain before the watching world exactly how slavery and these other things were influencing us. And so measured language, which is kind of a virtue in the academy, right? Of just saying, like, let's not, I was trained in the UK where everything is kind of like, calm and respected. Well, that's culturally conditioned. And so I had to learn to say, how do I, as a Christian, say as plainly as I possibly can what is happening in a way that the people who are experiencing it, who are experiencing the oppression, themselves feel represented by what I say. And so Frederick Douglass felt like he was someone who had come through slavery. He wasn't trying to, at every point, appease, potentially sympathetic abolitionists. He was trying to speak for his community. One of the prime examples of this in Frederick Douglass' biography is when he comes for Abraham Lincoln, when they are inaugurating the big statue to him, right? And so it's one of those things where that's one way in which that tradition shapes me. And so I think we have to, it's similar, sorry, this is an Anglican in me. There's one thing to say I read the church fathers and the church mothers, and I just kind of proof text them in sermons. It's another thing to read them and be shaped by them. And so what I'm hoping for then is allowing the African American Christian testimony of the past to shape how I do theology and biblical interpretation in the present.
We have a number of questions I want to get to. I want to ask you just one more question. I think a lot of the questions I see are kind of bringing us into the present. And I think we're having this conversation the night after the presidential debate occurred last night. And I came away from that just feeling gross and sad and embarrassed for the country, frankly. I mean, it was just a level of discourse that was, it wasn't discourse. It was in the tank. But I also came away hungry for a more constructive, conversation about what it looks like to forge a political life, a common life in America among those who are the same and those who are different, however you conceive of difference. And then, thinking more about what it looks like for Christians to engage in configurations or reconfigurations of power that are ultimately going to move in the direction of justice or a mutual flourishing. And I just wonder for you, how do you think about the starting place, either for followers of Jesus or those who are kind of are listening in on the conversation in the church, and really wondering where do they begin to engage this moment faithfully or well?
Well, a couple of things that I want to say is I think that in the present moment, it's very important to remain theological and to remain exegetical, and to really ask ourselves. And I'm teaching Ephesians, and right now we're doing chapter 5 tomorrow, and he talked about the children of the light, who if you come out of darkness into light, and you try to do what is righteous, what is good, and what is true. So, to be a Christian is to be in the light, to seek the righteous, the good, and the true. And then Paul says in, I think, verse 10, chapter 5, try to find out what the will of the Lord is, right? And have no partnership with shameful deeds, but rather expose them. And so the question, the hardest thing to do in the present moment is to ask ourselves, what is true, right? So we look at what's going on in society, and we don't ask this question, well, which articulation of the truth supports the party that I want to win? What's actually happening? And then it says, try to find out what the Lord wants you to do. Okay, now I understand. I now understand what's happening. What would God have me do? How would God have me live? And trying to discern what is true, and trying to figure out what God would have you to do, and having nothing to do with shameful deeds is part of our call in the present moment. And what we're doing instead, I think, is bending truth to suit our agendas. Because no politician ought to be comfortable around Christians. They ought to be discomfortable, because we ought to be the people who are unapologetically committed to the truth. And what I want to say is that the church needs to become dangerous again. And we're not dangerous. We're predictable. We're either like in this camp or that camp, or we're doing some kind of false equivalency, right? The truth isn't found in the middle, right? The truth is found on the side of the truth. So I'm not saying there's a pox on both houses on every issue. What I'm saying is we have to learn how to discern and call evil evil and good good, so that whoever is in the White House, for that person, Christians are a problem. And the Christians don't begin to say, you know what? My Christian duty in the public square is for every 4 years to cast a ballot for what I consider to be the lesser of two evils, but to actually civically engage in your community at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level, and ask, what would God have me to do? And so I think that the church right now is polarized, and we are being discipled by non-theologians. Right? We are. We're being discipled. So this is what I'm saying. There are things that a politician can say, and then when you come back to the church and your pastor preaches, and if your pastor disagrees with the politician's automatically assumed to be correct, right? And the pastor's having to think as a part of his calculus. How might this offend a constituency? And when the opposite isn't true. Politicians are not afraid of offending pastors. They're saying to pastors, you do this much and no more. So then how is this at all the church being dangerous? We talk about this language in the current election. I don't need a pastor, I need a president. But the president is pastoring us. Right? Is he not? Are we not allowing politics, the cluster of ideas, right? There's these ideas in the Democratic Party, these ideas in the Republican Party, and you got to choose one of these buckets. And nothing from this bucket, if you're in this team, can ever be true, good, and just, or nothing in the other bucket. And so we are then given two meals. Can I say there's no cheese on my hamburger? No, the hamburger comes with cheese, or you gotta get the fish sticks. Can I get ketchup with the fish sticks? No, you must get mustard, and that's it. Okay, these are my two options. I guess I'll eat fish sticks and mustard. Instead of saying, you don't own the restaurant. And so what I'm saying is the Christians ought to be the turning over of the tables in society and reminding our politicians of the limits of their competence. And instead, we are afraid of offending constituencies whose basic orientation to the world are defined by platforms.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of amens in the chat here, and there are a lot of questions that are pouring in. So I want to go to Billy and see if there's one you might want to lift up.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a bunch of great questions coming in. I apologize for going back and forth. They're coming in pretty frequently. So Chris, just stop me if we need to transition to a different question. But I'll start with a question here that we have actually from a student of a divinity school pursuing his MDiv. I'll read straight from it. It says, Dr. McCaulley, thank you for your time on this call and for your book, which has been deeply intriguing for me. I read your article in the New York Times some weeks back about Black anger, and again for a seminary class. Can you speak a little more to how you process through that, both on a biblical and a personal level?
Well, tell your professor to order the book. The article is just a summary of a whole chapter. That's the first thing. Tell your professor to quit being so cheap and get the whole book instead of the 1,000-word summary. No, I'm just kidding. It might be my own school. I mean, it could be that this is like my own institution. So I'll say this. There are things that are easy to write, and there are things that are difficult to write. And in the book, I write the chapter on Black anger or Black rage is something that I didn't look forward to writing. I didn't enjoy it. But I talk about the ticket to get into the party. And I think when people are suffering, when people are really going through something, they won't listen to you unless they know that you understand the depths of the problem, right? And so this is one of the reasons why some people fail to be able to effectively minister to African-American Christians, because they don't believe that the problem is that bad. And so I'm sorry that you feel this way, but they don't understand that I'm sorry that this is actually happening. So I don't need simply your empathy and my feelings. I need you to acknowledge the reality of what's happening inside of me because of what is actually being done to me. So it has to be not just an emotional connection, but an epistemological connection, a factual idea. And so that meant that I had to actually write in the first 2,000 words of that chapter what Black people had experienced in as unfiltered a way as I could. Because that takes me to a dark place. And one of the things that happens whenever there's an event that occurs, it's not simply that we're mourning the death of an individual, as horrible as it is, right? But like that Ahmaud Arbery doesn't exist alone, that he exists as a part of a narrative. And so part of what happens is that African Americans are consistently re-traumatized. And so what I would say is that, like, for me then, part of me dealing with it was coming to grips with the fullness of that problem and that reality. And so that's the one thing. So like I had to feel it. Then I asked the question, am I allowed to feel it? Am I allowed to feel these things? And what does that mean? And part of that is that's where I came to the Psalms. And when I started asking myself, this is how your location influences interpretation. When I said, what does it feel like to pray to God as a traumatized person? Then I went back and read all of the Psalms, where there's this deep wound that's gone on in the lives of a person. And he's saying these things to God. And what I wanted to say is that God can handle my anger. God can handle it as long as it's addressed to him as prayer, as something that I'm giving over to him. And so I would say that the Psalms, the imprecatory Psalms and the Psalms of Lament became a way of me processing these things. The funny thing about that article, now I'll try to shorten it, what I want to say. That article was actually written over the course of a week. The first part, I stopped. I mean, you haven't seen it, but like when I talked about like people smiling in front of the pictures of posing in front of lynchings, I had to stop writing the article because I didn't have any hope. It's almost like that song which says, "Darkness is my only companion." And so it was a week later, that I came back and wrote the second half of that song when I had spiritually made my way towards hope. And what I said in the chapter, which you have to read to kind of get the full shape of this argument, is that the miracle of the Bible is not that it depicts vengeance. I mean, that's just the stuff of humanity, right? The miracle of the Bible is that even in the Old Testament, where there are people who had every right to wish nothing but death upon their enemies, there's a vision of the salvation of the Gentiles. But what the Old Testament doesn't actually kind of settle on is how that occurs. And for the Christian, the New Testament is the cross, right? It's the cross that allows me to say that God takes sin utterly seriously, right? But that vengeance doesn't have to be the end. And that at the cross, I find the resources to love. And that is something that helps me be able to process it. But the other thing that sits in the background of all of this, though, is Christian eschatology. And as a Christian, I don't believe that it's simply, well, we forgive one another and we kind of go on. I believe as a Christian, there is an accounting for what was done to me. And so, although Christian eschatology frightens some people, it reminds me, as terrifying as it is, that God will ultimately be just. And so when I look at the entirety of the canonical witness, from the expressions of rage to the expressions of hope to the forgiving power of the cross, the Christian eschatology, somewhere in that matrix, I find my way towards hope.
Thank you for that. And he shot me another comment thanking you for your answer. He actually has the book. He's read it. He really enjoyed it.
I'm not mad at him. I'm mad at the professor. So no, he's fine. It's the professor.
I hear you.
I'm a professor too, and I know what it's like to say, well, do I got to order the whole book? But here's an article. So I'm going to take the New York Times article down.
Well, he appreciates your answer. So thank you for taking that on. Chris, do you have anything? I have another question here, but do you have anything you wanted to throw in?
Yeah, go ahead and jump in with another question, Bill.
Sure. So again, if you're watching, we have a bunch of questions. I'll try my best to get to what we can, but my apologies.
I'll be brief.
No, you're good. Take your time. We enjoy the hearing your thoughts. We have a question here. It says, and this is from a teacher here in Oxford. After listening to the podcast you recorded with Chris and Eddie, it's referring to the Wait podcast, a line that stuck out was, quote, "Racism is a heresy." Could you speak more to that? Racism as something fundamentally contrary to faith.
So it's funny, like the definition of heresy just means false teaching, right? It's an error, theological error. So when I say racism is a heresy, it's a theological error because the Bible speaks about every human being being made in God's image. In any kind of belief that creates a hierarchy of human beings, is a different account of what a person is. And I think, and it's also a central error, right? Because it's ascribing value to something to which God doesn't ascribe value to. And so it's a heresy because it's a faulty anthropology. And it's a faulty anthropology that then does all kinds of other damage. Because once you account someone as less than a person, it allows you to mistreat them, right? I mean, this is basically the thing, right? If it's not a person, then what I do to it doesn't matter. If it is a person, then it deserves dignity, respect, and honor. And so racism as a heresy is just racism saying it's a sub-Christian anthropology.
One of the kind of moving in the direction of not just diagnosing the problem and thinking about it theologically, or even kind of finding the resources to work through suffering, pain, emotion, etc., but then kind of moving in the direction of action. I think that's on everybody's mind. I think one of the chapters that I found just most provocative was Tired Feet, Rested Souls. And where you talk about political action and kind of this thing that Christians sometimes do between kind of spiritual realities and kind of social justice or social action. Yeah. And this is just one paragraph on page 49, where you're kind of wrestling with Dr. King's ministry, and then talking about how many Black Christians think about these things. The answer, you say, for most Black Christians is self-evident. We've never had the luxury of separating our faith from political action due to the era into which the church was born. The Black church found it necessary to protest a policy put in place by the state, slavery. Can you talk a little bit about just public action, or I guess political action for folks who want to push back on things that they see that are structurally wrong? And then also kind of, I mean, this kind of, I think it's locally impactful because there have been protests, there have been members of our church who participated in those people. Yeah. And we're also bumping up against kind of, for those who are kind of exasperated by the public symbolism around Confederate monuments and Board of Supervisors that voted to kind of keep that monument in place. There are people that are really struggling with that reality. I wonder if you'd speak to it.
Well, one thing is, I think that the pastor has to often recognize the limits of his or her competence. And so I'm not an economist, right? I'm not an immigration expert. I am not I don't have a 10-point platform on how to reform police. And when you live in a city and a community, there's a variety of issues that can sometimes hit you moment after moment, day after day, week after week. And so if you think it's the job of the pastor to like institute policy in every circumstance, then you're going to be frustrated. But I think that we can say that the Spirit of God that dwells within the community allows us to see injustice or recognize injustice when we see it, right? So don't lie to me about what I'm saying and say like, this is not what I'm experiencing. And so I think that the Christian community, broadly speaking, has the ability to discern injustice. And when we discern injustice, sometimes the solution is relatively clear, right? This symbol function is this way, then it's like, we should deal with it. And, like there's a clear solution. Other times it might actually be to say, you know what, there's problems with the school system. We're gonna call upon the elected leaders to actually do their job and come to us with 2 or 3 proposals as to how we might move forward as a society. So it's not the job of the pastor to be so caught up with saying, I don't know the exact solution. The first thing is, if you see something is wrong, you stand up and you push back, because we have that ability. The other thing that I want to say, especially to people who, for clergy in particular, is this is why God created the body of Christ. That it's not the job of the pastor to do anything, but somewhere in the congregation, there are lawyers, there are doctors, there are epidemiologists, there are people who have this kind of competence. And so it's important for the church, or maybe even religious leaders, to do the work of sounding the alarm and mobilizing the community, but then relying upon the collective wisdom of the Christian community to point the way forward. And so for me, if I was someone who is engaged in this work, I would ask myself, well, what level of clarity and expertise do I have? And what can I do in light of the expertise? So for example, something like the Confederate monuments, part of it comes to grips with the understanding like, okay, let's be honest. When these things were put up, Why were they put up? What purpose were they trying to serve? And like this is what I'm talking about when he says like to be a Christian is to be on the side of truth. We are not postmodernists. We think the truth is discoverable. So we have to say, beyond what I want to be true, what was the Confederacy? What was it about? And what kind of theology of the person existed there? And for the people who are critiquing things that related to the Confederacy, what is the nature of their critique? And do they actually have a point? And part of it is like we are so wrapped up, I guess, in like certain narratives that is of like we said, these certain political, cultural narratives that Christians can't always fight their way to the truth. So what would you do as a Christian? Fight your way to the truth, speak and act in accordance with your competence. So you will almost never hear me give you too many policy recommendations, because I haven't spent my life doing policy. I spent my life doing exegeting and learning Greek and Hebrew and enough German to get by.
Fair enough. I'm going to pitch it back to Billy and see if there's another question that you're seeing coming through, or one that you have of your own.
Sure. So looking at a couple of things that kind of tie into some common themes that you've actually begun to hit on. So obviously conversations of Confederate monuments are very prevalent here in Oxford, and I work with college students, and that's a conversation here at the University of Mississippi that we've had a bunch, and a lot of engaging any sort of question that discusses racism. A lot of kind of a knee-jerk reaction from some, frankly, from more people who are white privileged, whatever it may be. They tend to use the term colorblind. There's this whole idea of that colorblindness is the answer to racial issues, and you speak to that in a chapter that really spoke to me. Your chapter, Black and Proud, that talked a lot about Black identity, but also in terms of in the kingdom of God. I'll read just a quick quote. After you quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, you say, "Far from being colorblind, King called on his people to look upon themselves as Black and see in that blackness something beautiful. In doing so, King echoes the vision of Revelation in which each ethnicity brings its own unique glory to God." So I was wondering if you would just speak to
So the reason people talk about colorblind, because that often comes from Martin Luther King's "I have a day that one day my sister, the children will be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin." And so, okay, then like I'm engaging in colorblind theology, kind of following in King's own footsteps. But that's an edited King. King also says that like every Black person needs to kind of reach into the depths of their own soul and write their own Emancipation Proclamation. And they need to say to themselves, "I am Black and I'm proud, and I'm Black and I'm beautiful." So the question is, well, then which King are we going to cite? That's the first part, right? And so does the King who talks about color blindness also not see something beautiful about being Black? One of the things that's really interesting about this whole colorblind conversation is our Black skin was used against us for a very long time. And so then when we finally say, you know what, despite all of the horrible things that have been said about us, I'm going to value who I am as God's own creation. To hear the same, the ancestors of the people who use our skin color against us, to say that we now can't take pride in how God created us, it's kind of an ironic twist of fate, right? So it's almost like when we wanted to be judged by the content of our character, we weren't. When we said, okay, we want the content of our character and to affirm who we are, we say, well, no, you can't do that part. The second problem is like color blindness doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It's often deployed in particular circumstances, right? So when we say when African Americans are talking about racism, people go, "Well, I'm colorblind." Well, like I'm not asking you about like your color blindness. I'm talking about my experience. And so people are saying, well, if we just stop talking about race, then racism goes away. Imagine this. Just imagine for a second. If someone would say, if I would just stop talking about lust, adultery would go away. Nobody would say that. We would just start talking about greed would go away. We're gonna pretend that Apple doesn't exist, right? And people will just stop buying all of the products. No, we actually have to do this. We have to say, what are the ways in which our culture gives a distorted picture of sexuality? And then we have to articulate a healthy version. We don't just ignore it. So if our culture has a distorted picture of race and ethnicity, the solution is not to ignore it, but to articulate God's vision for the very peoples of the world. And then if you ask yourself the question, does God seem to think that ethnicity and culture is important? It's almost like it's on nearly every page of the Bible. What does he say to Abraham? I'm going to make you the father of many nations. So he doesn't say, Abraham, one day I'm going to get rid of ethnicity. He says, no. One day, the various ethnic groups of the world will gather under the worship of the one true God. When you get to the end of the Bible, God doesn't say, you know what? They came into heaven and I was colorblind. God said, I was glorified through having representatives from every tribe, tongue, and nation. So God seems to glory in difference, united under worship in him. And we say, well, the solution to the problem is to ignore the distinctive gifts that each culture brings to God. And I think that's just like ultimately unfaithful to the biblical witness and unfaithful to the reality, because it's used against Black people contending for justice. And the last thing I'll say about this is it might be the case. It might be the case. Maybe. The people who have experienced racism should be the ones who talk about the most helpful ways to deal with the problem. Now, maybe our competence is something that should be taken seriously. And what often occurs is we're treated as if we're incompetent to articulate the solutions to the problems. And our solution is to say, we want to affirm who we are as God created us while existing in community with our brothers and sisters. And the answer to the question that people might want to ask is, why would I say no to Black people who want to do that? And what gives me insight into their experiences so that I can tell them what they need to do?
I think that this thread or this part of the narrative for me is one that I've really kind of struggled with or wrestled with in terms of how to be supportive of the Black church in general. And then also because I think that I think I see it in kind of the difference between your work and Jamar Tisby's work, for instance, who wrote the Compromise. So I think that there are these two trajectories that I see in kind of Black church leaders who are doing work within majority culture spaces or trying to kind of reform the church from the inside for theological purposes. I see that kind of part of your trajectory, which is you're living into a vision of what the church is, that is every tribe, tongue, and nation, multi-ethnic. And then you see Jamar, who's coming over and thinking about his work as Black-centric, Black-owned, kind of creating space outside of white spaces for the sake of Black flourishing and faithfulness. And I think that's something that we struggle with, I think, in the white church is what does it look like to be, faithful brothers and sisters in Christ and to support and build up the Black church as it bears witness to the gospel that has, I think gives life both internally, but also has this broader witness.
Well, I think the key is to have not a one size fits all model. So, for example, Japan, I lived in Japan. Japan is like 98% Japanese. So it's not going to be a multi-ethnic church. It's going to be Christians in Japan. They're going to attend and the Japanese Christians don't need to move to Korea to kind of create a multi-ethnic church. And so I'm assuming they're viewing parts of Iowa. I've never been to Iowa, but I'm assuming there's a lot of white people there. You'll have a white church there. And so it's not that like one size fits all. It's that we have to ask ourselves, in the United States, you're in like a city, and the city itself is diverse, then like there ought to be churches that model that. So it doesn't mean that every church has to, enculturate every aspect of the gospel in their local communities, right? Some churches are stronger in mission, some churches are stronger in discipleship. But the question you have to ask yourself is, if I'm not pursuing diversity, like to what end, right? So some churches don't have the gift in mission. It could be because they just don't have a lot of talented people, but it also could be because they just are internally focused. And so you can have the same result. We don't have a strong missionary wing, but for different reasons. And so the real question is like to examine a church and say, are we monocultural because we don't have a vision for it, or because it costs us too much to do it? or we're monocultural because of like whatever historical circumstances. And we do have to recognize that some African American Christians who are in Black churches precisely because they can grow and flourish as leaders there, and that they came, if if all Black people shut down all Black churches and came in a majority white church, we wouldn't become pastors. Right, we would all become, and so like one of the good things about the Black church is that it is a leadership pipeline. Right. And so there do need to be spaces where African Americans have a chance to order their own life and witness, and there do need to be places where we're together. The interesting thing about this is like, I wish that I could. This is already out, and with this, who knows when the second book's ever going to come out? But the second book that I have coming is called New Testament in Color, and so the first book, Reading While Black, it's pointed like an arrow to one community. The second book, The New Testament in Color, is a multi-ethnic commentary on the New Testament. It brings Black, white, Asian, and Latino scholars and First Nation scholars all together to write a single volume commentary on the New Testament, such that the exegetical community that produces the work looks like the church. And so both of those things are necessary in the church's witness. And I don't think that any of them are inherently sinful. It just depends on like how that community is shaped and what its ethos is. And so I would say the last thing is like, if you want Black people or people of color in your church, you ought to be willing to love them well. And if you're not willing to love them well, then you should invite them into your communities.
We've got about 5 or 6 more minutes. I've got
Sorry about that. I talked too long.
No, man. No, that's not a commentary on your answers. I just kind of letting Billy know as well. Is there any? I've got a couple more questions, but I wanted to give you a chance if you had something.
So there's a couple questions coming in. There's one that just came in. It was good, but you kind of just hit at it. But I think just one question that I had that you might have spoken on, and yes, I am absolutely frantically going through notes. I apologize. But there was a question that came in that kind of ties into a question I have here, specifically on the topic of Black anger. The question that came in was, how does Black anger mix within Micah 6:8's call to walk humbly with your God? And I think a second question that I would add to this participant's question is just, what is true biblical peace? Because we have you have plenty of people who wish to not really engage in the work of justice, who just call for peace. Yet there seems to be a difference, without ranting on my end, there seems to be a difference between biblical peace and how we tend to understand peace in the world.
Yeah, so I would talk about like walking humbly with one's God does not like step on the reins of human emotions, right? So like the question isn't like, how do you reconcile Black anger with walking humbly with your God? It's like, how do you actually reconcile the salt with that, right? So like, this is not saying that like Black people it's saying like the Bible itself depicts anger at injustice. And so the question isn't whether or not we feel these emotions, because those emotions are the kinds of things that biblical Christians have. Jesus himself is upset in the temple because of the way in which he sees injustice going on. The question is, what do we do with that anger? And so I do think that there are sinful ways or destructive ways, and the sinful and destructive ways of processing anger. Anger can lead towards nihilism, which can lead towards alienation from God. And so what I want to say is like, how do we work through that anger towards something productive? Now, as it relates to the question of peace, I want to say is that we think oftentimes of peace is simply the absence of conflict, or we think about peace as kind of denouncing the extremes of both sides and standing in the middle. But a simple way of saying it is like, I have 2 kids up there, or 4, but if my 10-year-old punches the 6-year-old and the 6-year-old, and they start fighting with one another, I have to come and adjudicate what occurred. Yes, there was sin on both sides, but I need to say, well, you punched them for no reason because they took your book, right? Okay, then you bear the greater responsibility in this altercation. Although both people did wrong, she shouldn't have taken your book, you escalated by punching them, right? So like, I can do that. So then after that's happened, I can then say, now the 2 of you, this issue's been settled, we want you to reconcile. You give the book back, you apologize, this is what peace looks like. So the Christian then who's engaged in the process of peacemaking, it can't be separated from truth telling. So the cheap way out is to say, you know what, both sides are horrible, so let's just ignore both of them. No. This is why I talk about truth, what is actually occurring. And that means in some cases To be a peacemaker may mean to actually take a side against the other side, right? This is the innocent party. This is the aggrieved party. And you need to recognize the aggrieved party's problems, repent, and then the two of you can be peaceful. And so to me, peacemaking can't be separated from truth telling. So there's a way, for example, with the Confederate flag to say, you know what, let's just learn to love one another despite our differences. Well, that's true. But you also ought to be able to say, well, hold on. We can access the truth about why these things are here and what they mean. And to be a Christian to say, well, true peace then only comes when we recognize that the grievances brought against these things are ultimately correct. And so I want to talk about that. But then the question becomes, well, then why are you engaged in this process at all? Because God wants, so our peacemaking is an enacted parable of the gospel. That God wants us to be reconciled to him and with one another. And so peacemaking, when done well, poses the question, why are the Christians this way? Why are the Christians on the side of truth? Why are the Christians on the side of peace? Because these are the things that our King is on the side of. And so peacemaking, which is inseparable from social action, is pre-evangelistic. It introduces people to the ethos of the kingdom. So in some senses, and I want to make sure I say this as clearly as possible, I'm not concerned first and foremost with the future of America. I'm concerned with the kingdom of God. And such that America knows, whether they listen or they don't, that there was something distinctive about what the Christians had to offer to the watching world. And so peacemaking then, to me, is an important part of the church's witness to show that we're not trapped by the binaries that they offer us.
That's very, I think, poignant and powerful. It connects to me to this conversation that you kind of get into about the way in which American Christian political theologies get off the ground in relation to submission to authority, to political authority. And you say submission is not acquiescence. There is a sense in which if there are, we are, I'll just quote from page 33, we are allowed to discern and even condemn evil like the prophets did. We're allowed to resist like the Hebrew midwives. This doesn't place limits on our ability as Christians to call evil by its name, but it does obligate us to be willing to suffer the consequences of living in a fallen world. I think that there is a sense in which peacemaking, truth-telling involves a kind of cost, and I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that. If someone either is watching the church and hoping for more faithfulness there, or someone who wants to take another step in the direction of this work, I guess, would you reflect for yourself? I've heard you talk about this in your call narrative, that you were on this trajectory and journey towards being a successful New Testament scholar. And there were these moments where you recognized the cost and had to turn back to your community, to your home. And I guess the way I would ask you to frame it is as you think about your work at the end, kind of as you hope it will be, what's it going to look like for you to be successful, or for you to be faithful?
Well,
and what do you worry about?
I'll put it this way. Nobody called me a critical race theorist when I was writing about Paul and the inheritance law. And if I wanted to be like, I mean, this is what I'm saying. Like, I know exactly what the boundaries are. I know the kinds of things that you can say to be accepted in white evangelical spaces. I know the kinds of things that you have to say to be accepted in white mainline spaces. I know them. I know the exact kind of dog whistles that I can articulate that gains me interest into those communities. And so there was an academic path for me of like relative ease. But I tell the story of like, it's apocryphal, right? About the martyrdom of Peter, where Peter is fleeing Rome and he sees a picture of Jesus heading back into the city. And then he asks him, Quo vadis, where are you going? And Jesus says to Peter, I'm going back to the city to be with my people. And Peter then turns back and he goes back into Rome, where he's martyred alongside Paul. And so part of what I said to myself is, I have to speak to the issues of the day using the gifts that God has given to me. And it's come at great cost. I mean, great cost maybe an exaggeration because I'm not a martyr, but it's caused like misunderstanding. I've been criticized. I've been called like everything but a child of God on the internet. My faith has been questioned. My like ordination vows have been questioned. And it's not easy, because I'm not naturally a combative person. Everyone likes to be liked. But every single Black Christian who's spoken about justice has been like disproportionately criticized and called horrible things. And so what do I want from my career? What does success look like for me? I think of when I was a teenager. I would go to church. I don't know if everyone ever did this when they went to church, but I would go to church with a plan of sinning later on in that week. Maybe it was Sunday, I had some good sins planned for Friday. And I would say to myself, not necessarily conscious, but subconsciously, if the pastor convinces me to be Christian for another week, I'm not going to act a fool on this weekend. So at the end of the sermon, it's like, you know what? He had a good word. I got to stay for another week, right? And so whenever I began to preach, I had in my mind the person who came into the church who said, this is my last time. And so I preached like to that person to stay for one more week. And so I say part of my scholarship then is to keep people Christian, to make Christianity plausible and thinkable and livable for another week, another month, or another year. And so everything that I write will eventually be surpassed. I mean, that's just the nature of scholarship. Everything that I write will enter eventually the dustbins of history. But if I made it possible for people, especially Black people in this country, in this moment, and other people as well, to remain Christian, to continue to follow Jesus, then I succeeded in my scholarship. That's a long way of saying that my goal is to have Jesus say, well done, our good and faithful servant. And in every generation, that's the call of the Christian minister, right? To make Christianity livable and thinkable in a world that exists in opposition to the gospel.
I think we need to wrap up tonight, but I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with us tonight, Dr. McCaulley. And we're grateful to all of you who stuck out the evening with us. We'll be, Billy, any last words from you before we
I'd say, personally to you, Dr. McAlilly, thank you so much. This book
You're
has
welcome.
been very eye-opening, very just helpful for me. And I want to say to any of you watching, Reading While Black, African-American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope. I believe Square Books still has some copies if you're in Oxford, so swing by there. But definitely look it up. Go to Dr. McCauley's website, and you can find it there. If you're any one of our college students who is watching, just come to my office, and I will give you this one.
Look at this.
But I encourage you to give it a read. It was really eye-opening. So, and very just a fantastic book. So thank you so much, Dr. McCauley, for joining us. Thank you for everyone watching for being a part of the conversation. It's been an honor to be a part of it. So that's what I'd say.
I want to go ahead, Dr. McCauley.
I was going to say thank you for everybody who took the time to listen. I mean, I don't know what I was doing on a Wednesday night when I was in college, but it wasn't listening to the people talking about books. So God bless you. Great is your reward in heaven.
There you go. Well, if you want to keep the conversation going, we want to do that as well. As Billy said, we do have some copies at Square Books in town that you can pick up. And we're looking at doing a kind of a book study on the book for 7 weeks, starting on October the 15th. We're going to do 12:30 to 1:30, so kind of a late lunch, early afternoon on Thursdays. If you want to be a part of that, we'll be putting information about that on social media and in the bulletin and newsletter.
Shout out to Taylor. I know you, Taylor. Hey, how's it going?
We're grateful to you guys for being here tonight, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care.